Welcome back to the Talking Crop podcast. My name is Kathryn Seebruck, and I'm a commercial agriculture educator with University of Illinois Extension, serving Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. Talking Crop is a row crop production podcast with episodes occurring every other week during the growing season between May and September. In each episode, I bring on a guest speaker to discuss topics related to their areas of expertise. Today's episode marks the beginning of Talking Crop's third season, and we have another great lineup of guests this year. Episodes are recorded throughout the growing season to ensure that the information provided is both topical and relevant. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Giovani Preza-Fontes, Extension Field Crop Agronomist in the Department of Crop Sciences at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We discussed this year's planting and early season growing conditions, as well as Giovani's recent work on soybean performance and conservation cropping systems. In the episode description, you'll find the FarmDoc Crop Central article that Giovani references, as well as a link to Giovani's lab website where you can find more extension resources and learn more about the research they perform. For the next episode of Talking Crop, Dr. Patrick Tranel, professor of weed molecular biology and genomics with University of Illinois, joins me to discuss metabolic herbicide resistance, including the recently documented case of glufosinate resistance in water hemp in Illinois. That episode will air on Wednesday, May 27th. And now, please enjoy this episode of Talking Crop, 2026 Planting and Growing Conditions with Giovani Preza-Fontes. Hello, Giovani, and welcome to the Talking Crop podcast.
Hi, Kathryn. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking the time out of what I'm sure is a busy time right now to be here and talk with me today. I first wanted to have you take a second to introduce yourself. So who you are, what you do, and a little bit of your background and what your research focus is for the folks who are listening.
Sure thing. Yeah. So again, my name is Giovani Preza-Fontes. I joined the Department of Crop Sciences as a faculty back in the fall of 2022. So I do hold a 3-way split appointment in the land grant system, which means that I get to do all the 3 jobs. So teaching classes in crop sciences, and I also serve as the Field Crop Extension Agronomist for the state. I do have a 30% extension appointment. So again, yeah, and in addition to teaching in crop sciences, I think most of my time it's out in the field doing research and some outreach activities. A little bit of the background. Again, as the state agronomist, a lot of my research is focused on crop management, and basically a lot of the research we do is kind of designed to feed Illinois Extension recommendations and guidelines that we put out. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is on corn and soybean. Mostly because, those are the 2 primary crops that we have in the state. I am excited a little bit, though, that we'll start some research with winter wheat this fall. Wheat is the established crop in southern Illinois, and I'm a big proponent of extended crop rotation and the wheat double crop system. So I'm kind of a little excited to start a little work on that realm as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because just this past year, there was someone who farms right by where I live that they, all the way up here in far northern Illinois, they did double crop wheat and soybeans. So that was interesting to see up here where it's not very common at all.
Yeah, and it's not. I've been working with a farmer in central Illinois that started growing wheat, and then we've been doing some preliminary trials looking at double crop soybean management. But we see that, with changes in the weather and, the extent of the growing season, we see that that kind of wheat double crop soybean idea kind of moving to central and even northern Illinois. So it's a little exciting.
So I should mention for those listening that we are recording this a couple weeks away from when this episode will be released. So today is Friday, May 1st, and this episode will release on Wednesday, May 13th, I believe. So some of the things that we're talking about now obviously could change between now and then. But Giovani, I was hoping you could talk about how planting conditions this year compare with those of last year and maybe some of the implications for those differences. And I know, you're in central Illinois, I'm in northern Illinois, but I do know in general that overall this spring has been maybe a little bit wetter and a little bit more exciting in terms of weather patterns than the past couple of years have been.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to go back to conditions in March, right? So even though March ended up being wetter than normal across much of the state, we saw that it was dry enough in some areas that we saw farmers starting to plant by the end of March. Just for the record, I think I wrote that on my article on Crop Central. We got about 4.8 inches of rain in March across the state, which was 1.9 inches above normal. And even in our trials, like I do have some planting day trials for corn and soybean that we've been doing every year at the research centers. And even us, we were able to start planting late March. For example, in Monmouth, our first planting date was March 25th. And we were able to plant on March 30th at the research center near Perry. We could have planted late March in Urbana, but we just got busy and then we started getting some rainfalls the first week of April that pushed our first planting day to April 12th. But other than that, I think, the spring, it was similar to what we've experienced in the past couple of seasons. It was, again, dry enough that we see the planting started like late March and early April.
Yeah, so we haven't really seen a huge pushback on those planting dates.
No, not all. And it's actually, if you look at the USDA NASS progress reports, you can see that we are way ahead in terms of planting progress compared to last season and on the average of the past 5 years. So, for example, we started to see, 1% of the corn and soybean planting by the first week of April or so. That's been kind of becoming the norm now, at least in the past 3-4 years that I've been here. So yeah, if you look at the USDA reports, and I think if you know a lot of the discussions that we've been hearing lately about should you plant corn or soybean first, I think if you look at the USDA report for this year, and a lot of the farmers are planting soybean first. Which was a little impressive in terms of, how much we were able to plant in the first couple of weeks of April.
It's interesting that some are starting to plant their soybeans first and get them done pretty early. Actually, I was just talking to a fellow educator in the Springfield area, and he knows a producer who had all of his soybeans done by mid-April, so about like April 15th, which is really, really crazy, especially, up here. That's unheard of, being this far north. And obviously folks are interested in that yield advantage of getting those soybeans in early. But like you were mentioning, just planting progress in general is, we can say, ahead of schedule. So what are the, I guess, positive implications of that? And then maybe more of the, maybe not negative implications, but some agronomic factors to consider when planting is completed or is started that early in the season when it's typically a little bit cooler and wetter?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that timely planting, it's one of the key practices for, maximizing yield potential on both crops, right? Corn and soybean, our data shows that they do perform well when we plant timely. And I like to say timely and not early because, when we look back again in our planting day trials, what we see is there is a kind of a window for timely planting where we see maximum yields on both corn and on both crops. So, for example, if you look at corn planting day, the planting day trial for corn, what we see is that anytime the corn was planted between the mid and the end of April, that's when we see, kind of a maximum yields on average. And then, of course, yield starts to decline as we move into May, but it doesn't, yield losses are not that much. We only see about 4 to 5% yield losses by May 15. But then after May 15, those losses are starting to increase at a faster pace.
Mm-hmm.
When we get to late May, we're losing about 15% of the yield potential. And it's the same for soybean. For soybean, we do see a little wider window. Our data shows that, optimum planting window for soybean, especially in central and northern Illinois, has been, around April 10th to the April 13th. I mean, again, roughly 3 weeks there where we can see, maximum yields on general. So I kind of like to talk about planning on time because there's no, it's not a calendar date. I like to think about, the conditions are right. Look at the forecast to see, the next week, rainfall and the weather, right? Because you want to start off the crop in a good, start off good. So, you're kind of building your potential since day one.
So with those planting date studies, this is alluding to what you were just mentioning. You have a goal of planting on X date or by X date, but sometimes the conditions don't always align with that date. So with those studies, do you plant or try to plant, regardless of conditions, or do you really try to make sure and wait to make sure that the conditions, are right? I guess I'm just wondering, like with that data, are conditions taken into account for when planting occurs?
Yeah, no, that's a good comment that we need to address. And yes, with our planting day trials, our first planting day was always, when the soil was fit to plant. So we were not trying to plant just early, just because we, on a calendar day. So our first planting day is always usually when the soil is fit, it's not too wet, that you can see some issues there with sidewall compaction and some of that will kind of restrict germination and root development. So again, we've been doing planting day trials, and when I say we, it's kind of Illinois Extension with my predecessor, Dr. Emerson Apseger. He's been doing planting day trials for corn and soybeans since 2010. And again, it's mostly here in central Illinois and northern Illinois. One of the challenges we've seen is the planting day trials in southern Illinois is that, most of the time we don't start planting until late May because, it's always seems to be always wetter there. And if you can either plant early but if you can, then you just get wet and then push until the end of May. So, with our data, if I can remember on the top of my head, we've seen some years where we planted very early, like March 30th. In the past couple of years, we were able to plant, the first week of April. And again, we don't see much benefit in terms of yield potential when we plant early April or mid-April or even end of April. It's very interesting that in some years, we actually do not see any planting date effect, at least at Monmouth, when we look at the data. So like anytime we planted between early April to late May, sometimes we don't see like a planting date effect there. And again, it's just because, I think that the weather conditions during the growing season actually plays a lot more than when we plant the crop. I mean, we know that timely planting is key for maximizing yields, but we do rely on favorable weather conditions during the season to kind of take advantage of all that good start that we have.
Right. And so for those individuals who do plant, maybe you could consider it relatively early. So I'm thinking of folks who have planted already up here, and now we're seeing, we have like a freeze warning, I think, tonight. So we have had some relatively cool night temperatures, and the daytime temperatures haven't been that great either. So what are some implications for those folks who have planted and now those crops are, trying to germinate and emerge in those cool, wet soils?
Yeah, there are a few things to keep in mind. I think one of them is imbibitional chilling injury. So that basically is if temperatures drop when after planting, right? So when the seed first start, absorbing water, they usually do that the first 12 or 24 hours. So we usually see some imbibitional chilling injury there if if the temperatures drop too much and that water is kind of very cold, when the seeds absorb that first water, that's when we see some of those injuries. But again, it only happens like the first day or so. So if temperatures did not drop the first when the seed starts to absorb some of that water, we don't really see much of those injuries. But again, it can happen for both corn and soybeans. But again, it's something that we don't see that much. On the other side is like when the soybeans or the corn, it's emerging, and then they're at the VE stage, emergence, right? So when the coleoptile is above the soil surface, you can actually see the plant. I think that's when we started to have maybe a higher risk for frost injury, especially for soybeans, because the growing point is above the soil surface, right? So if you get some frost injury there, that kills that growing point, that plant is dead, right? So you ended up with lower stand, and depending on how severe those low stands are, that always gonna affect final yield. For corn, I would say that corn probably less risk than soybean, just because the growing point is still below the soil surface when they emerge, right? We know that the growing point will stay below ground until V5, V6. But again, it depends on how cold it gets, right? Because if it gets too cold and that soil temperature near the growing point gets to freezing or below freezing, then you do have some risk for frost injury. But again, I think temperatures are going down. Air temperatures are going down. But if you look at soil temperatures, they tend to be a little higher than the air, just because, the ability of the soil to hold heat and energy.
So once crops start to emerge, what are some things, like key things, that you encourage farmers to be watching out for once crop emergence starts to occur?
Thinking about what we've seen, for example, in the past week, right? When we look at planting progress, again, we saw a lot of planting happening the last two weeks of April, right? We saw a lot of people trying to plant as much as they could in anticipation of the rain, especially here, like in Champaign, like I live like in the countryside of Toronto, so there's a soybean field back here now this year. So we saw a lot of people planting over the weekend, right before the rain we got on Monday. So I think, depending on how much rain we got, for example, I think here in Urbana we got over an inch of rain, but like in Perry and Monmouth we got almost more than 2 inches of rain. Right. So if you plant in heavy rainfalls after planting, it's kind of probably one of the biggest concern that I have when it comes to planting time. And that's because, saturated soils can actually have a very negative effect on emergence and everything that comes with it. So again, just by driving around this week, we've seen a lot of parts of the field, the low parts of the field where, you have standing water for more than 2 days. That's definitely probably gonna have some effect on germination. So one of the things that I would encourage farmers to do is just keep an eye on their field and see how emergence it's been, especially in those low-lying areas where soils tend to be saturated longer, or even standing water, because again, if you have saturated soils or standing water for more than two days, I think that's enough to actually kill the seedlings, right? Because once the seedlings start to germinate, they're just gonna die by the lack of water because of the lack of oxygen, just because of the saturated conditions. And I think that's all kind of keeping in mind for replanting decisions, right? I hope that we don't get to that case. But again, for those fields that we've got a lot of rainfall after planting, I think that's my main concern, is to kind of keep an eye on emergence and see how soybean or corn establishes, and then the stands, mostly for replanting decisions, especially now because we're still on time. Again, If we have to replant the first week of May or the second week of May, I think that's way better than trying to replant by the end of May.
Looking forward, the last couple of years, we've seen some really good yields. And you mentioned earlier that this planting season, the conditions have been relatively similar to the past couple of years. And obviously, we can't control the weather. We can't totally predict what's going to happen throughout the rest of the growing season. But what is your take on why we saw really good yields these past couple of years, and what needs to happen for that setup to occur again?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, there is something that I noticed. Again, I try to write an article every year, kind of summarizing the growing season and how the crops perform in Illinois. One thing that I noticed since 3 years in a row, or even 4 years in a row, was the fact that we did have, relatively dry conditions in June, but then we got enough timely rainfall around pollination, especially around corn pollination, that really helped, with that success of pollination and just getting the highest potential of kernel numbers, which one of the yield components. And then I think the other part is that, if you look at the conditions in August and September, which is when the crops are feeling grain, it's been conditions, I would say it has been above average. And I think that's really helped, making sure that we started to see heavier kernels and heavier soybean seeds. I think this is one of the things that, I've noticed and I think the high yield it's mainly because the relatively dry conditions after planting, I think that actually help. If the lack of standing water in the fields just make emergence better, more efficient, and again, the lack of standing water, the plants are just able to establish very well, develop really good root systems. And again, I think the yields that we've seen only came because some of those early season dryness was relieved by timely rainfall around flowering and pollination, and then again during grain filling period. So this is something that we've seen in the past 3-4 years, and it seems to be kind of, consistent because we've seen very, very good years, very good yields. If we were to wish for a weather, I think that will be something that I would wish for again.
Sure. Yeah. It's just a matter of, will we get that lucky again?
Yeah. And I think one last interesting thing too from last year is, I think for you guys in Northern Illinois was the same case too, because we got a lot of rain in July, but then the tap water kind of shut off, and we got very, very minimal rainfall in August. For example, in Malmöth, the research center in Malmöth, we only got about 1.2 inches of rain between August 1st and mid of September. And that's the time when the corn and the soybean is feeling grain, right? So I remember there was a lot of discussion about, how this dry weather was affecting yields. And I think the other thing that, interesting on the other side of the coin is that, it was so dry, but, we got a lot of rain in July. That if you think about, the ability of our soils to hold that water, I think that we probably need to give more credit than we usually do. Because I think that's what happened, on our good mollisols here in central and southern Illinois. I think we were able to hold that 5 to 6 inches of water at the profile that we really needed during the grain filling period. And again, it was dry, so a lot of people were concerned about how the dryness was going to affect grain filling. We did see, some areas that didn't receive a lot of rainfall, that kernel weight and soybean seed weight was lower than normal, meaning that, it lowered yields. But again, overall, I think yields were better than expected for most people, I would say.
Yes, and let's hope that happens again. Like I said, we may not get that lucky, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. So shifting gears a little bit, Giovani, I wanted to talk about a study that I believe is still ongoing. You're not quite finished with it yet, but it's looking at soybean performance in conservation systems. And before we get into the specifics of that, I just had a general question for you. You work on agronomics in corn and soybeans. You have for a while now. Are you seeing a general shift towards more of a focus on agronomics in conservation systems specifically?
I think the shift comes from, just to kind of back up a little bit and kind of discuss some of the reasons why we started that project that was funded by Illinois Soybean Association was, my first year when I moved here, my first growing season was actually in 2023, right? And I think folks will remember some of the dust storms that we saw in central Illinois. 2023 especially, we had a bad one around Springfield. It was news on a lot of outlets nationwide because, it was around the I-55 south of Springfield. That dust storm kind of led to a pile crash of vehicles. If I remember right, we had over 70 cars piled crash and dozens of injuries, and at least 2 or 3 people died. So again, I guess that was my first growing season, and we started to get a lot of discussion around, kind of a renewed attention on conservation practices, which is something that we know, right? We know that reduced tillage, no-till, or any practice that you're keeping the soil covered with crop residues or living crops such as cover crops, we know that it's kind of reducing the risk of soil erosion. We're keeping the soil in place, and actually, in addition to all of the benefits that we know that we get from, some of those no-till cover cropping systems. I think that's when we kind of started that project again to kind of look and say, we know all these benefits, but when we look at adoption, it's still low. I think I had one of my students looking at data from the Illinois Department of Ag. If you look at no-till corn in the state, it's only about 15 to 20% of the corn, it's no-till. And for soybean, it's about 35, I believe, 35 or 40% of the soybean, it's no-till. So, I think what we were trying to do here is kind of look whether we could maintain soybean productivity under more conservation systems and hopefully show farmers that, yes, we can maintain high yielding soybeans while using some of those conservation practices. So I think that's what the idea when we started to do this project.
And so what did this project specifically look at?
Yeah, so we have a total of 12 treatments in this project. We have, it's a combination of 4 tillage systems, and we also had a starter fertilizer treatment here because a kind of a second question on this project was we wanted to see if starter fertilizer could help offset some of those early season challenges that we've seen in conservation systems, which is, just because we're keeping the soil covered with residue, we tend to see kind of a slower early season growth on both corn and soybeans. We can also argue about nutrient availability in those systems, especially if you're planting soybean after high residue corn, and in addition to having a cover crop, for example, zero cover crop residue there. So you have a lot of residue that it's kind of a little bit of challenging to manage it. But basically going back to the treatments, we had 4 tillage treatments that we compared: a conventional tillage, which is a conventional 2 passes here in the state. I think a lot of people are doing a fall chisel and then a Springfield, a field cultivator in the spring. So 2 passes. And then we had a strip till that we did in the fall, and a no-till, and a no-till plus zero cover crop. So the idea here is that you're already doing no-till, might as well do a cover crop just because And then each tillage system was paired with 3 fertilizer treatments. We always have an untreated control where we don't apply any fertilizer. And then we had 2 starter fertilizer treatments were the application of nitrogen as UAN. We apply 15 pounds of nitrogen as starter. So we worked with the farmers that had the 2x2 system, starter system. So applying the fertilizer 2 inches to the side and 2 inches below the seed. And the other treatment was a combination of nitrogen plus sulfur. So we, again, 15 pounds of nitrogen plus 10 pounds of sulfur. And we did that by blending UAN and ammonium thiosulfate, which is a source that a lot of people are using nowadays.
Was there anything in particular that stuck out to you with the results?
Yeah, we started that project in 24. So 24 and 25 were the first 2 years of the project. And if you folks look at our article that we published on Crop Central early this year, we kind of summarized the findings from the first 2 years. It was interesting to see that, as we expected, we did see kind of an early season benefits from having the starter fertilizer on soybeans, especially on the no-till and the no-till with cereal-rye cover crop. When we had the starter fertilizer, the plants were able to grow a little better and put a little bit more leaf area versus without the starter fertilizer. And that was visual too. And I mean, we also took biomass samples at V4 to kind of quantify that effect. But again, we often see greener plants and a little bit of more biomass and more leaf area when we had the starter fertilizer versus when we didn't apply the starter fertilizer. Later in the season, we tissue tested at R2. And again, we did that just to kind of look at nutrient status mid-season. A lot of people are using tissue testing analysis to look at nutrient status. So we did that. And it was interesting to see that by mid-season, we could not see any differences in tissue testing. Meaning that, the early season advantage we saw with starter fertilizer kind of diminished or was offset by mid-season. The other interesting thing too is that when we looked at the nitrogen and sulfur concentrations at R2, all of our numbers were above the critical levels that we usually see on the literature. So that tells us that even the treatments that didn't receive any starter fertilizer, they were above critical levels, indicating that they were not deficient in nitrogen and sulfur. So that means to us that, you can think about that, these were in high yielding environment. So a lot of those trials were here in central and northern Illinois and also central northern Iowa. So very good mollisols with high percent organic matter. So that tells us that, we may see some early season slower growth, but then once conditions are good for mineralization, we see that mineralization is kind of being able to supply a lot of the nutrients to the crop. And we know that soybeans also has the symbiotic relationship with bradyrhizobin that, that's where they get usually half of their nitrogen from fixation. So again, that's what we saw mid-season. And then, and then at the end of the season, when we look at yields, we also found very interesting results. We had 8 locations across those 2 years. And when we look at the data across all sites in years, we did not see any yield differences between or among the tillage treatments, which is something that, I think it's something that we were kind of hoping to find. I mean, we don't really do research to hope to find things, but this is something that we kind of hypothesize maybe, that we could maintain productivity under more conservation tillage systems. So overall, we saw very little differences yield-wise among the tillage treatments. I think we saw higher yields with the conventional and the strip till. And on average, I think we average about 74 bushels per acre. And then on the no-till and the no-till plus zero rye cover crop, we averaged 73 bushels per acre. So like 1 bushel, but not statistically different. And again, even though we saw some early season benefits from the starter fertilizer, that did not translate to higher yields as well, because we did not see any starter fertilizer effect on grain yields.
Yeah, and that article that you mentioned, I will have that linked in the episode description for those who are interested in looking at it. And I encourage you to, because that early season advantage that you're mentioning, Giovani, is so stark in those photos that you have that comparison of the two treatments. And those plants that receive that starter look so good in comparison to those that don't. So when you look at that, you think, oh, this is a no-brainer. Like, you need that starter. There's going to be a huge difference come harvest. And as you found, very surprisingly, just based on those pictures alone, at least, there was no difference. So yeah, that was really interesting to see and hear about. And so with that, I think you guys have 1 more year left in the study, correct?
Well, we do have 2 locations that we have the plots in place since 2024. So we start in 2024, so with the soybean field. And then 2025, on the year 2, we established soybean in a different field. But then we know that corn, corn and soybean rotation is the standard in Illinois, basically. So what we started doing is that now we have both crops present at the same time on those 2 fields. And then now we're able to rotate corn and soybean back. So basically what I'm trying to say is that we kept the same treatments and followed the first year soybean with corn. So the idea is to keep that rotation going for at least 4 or 5 years. And I think that will be a very nice data set that can tell us, what we can expect to see in terms of not only soybean now, but we added corn in the rotation too. So I think what I'm interested to kind of document and see it's how that those tillage treatments are influencing corn and soybean yields. As the system evolved, right? Because I think one of the caveats that we try to highlight in the article is that, we try to kind of on the discussion to kind of emphasize that, we started this project in 2024. We've done it for 2 years. This is the results that we found. And I think the caveat is that, you need to think about this as kind of a transitioning to conservation tillage system, right? Because we started off on a field where it was conventional tillage. Then we started adopting those strip till, the no-till. So, the first 2 years, this is what we can expect to see. And now I'm interested in kind of 5 years from now and say, hey, we're 5 years in, keeping the plots the same. So systems with no-till or strip till or zero rye cover crop. And this is what we've seen after 5 years. So I think that's my goal. So I wanted to keep that rotation going for a couple more years. And we do that here with the non-farm trial near Hammond. We do a lot of research with this farmer in his field. And we also collaborate with Dr. Amir Sadepur from Southern Illinois University. So he also has that field established in the SIU research farm in Carbondale. So those are the 2 locations where we're planning to keep the rotation going for a couple more years.
Interesting that you answered my next question, which was going to be whether you're going to look at the same study with corn, because I think a lot of folks will be interested in that. And it's funny because you mentioned kind of that shift towards conservation. And with that, many folks will start, doing cereal rye before soybeans first before they start doing it cereal rye before corn. Mm-hmm. And I like too that you guys are going to be doing it a little bit more long term, because some folks, I should say, when they start using cover crops or switching to no-till, after a year or maybe 2, it might not look the way that they want it to, and they might kind of give up and go back to the status quo. But it usually takes those few, like upwards of 5 years, to start seeing some of those benefits. And so it'll be interesting to see if you guys notice any differences between these first couple of years and what you'll see come the end of year 5.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we were trying to achieve. And I think you you said it better. So yeah, we do get a lot of questions from farmers about, like we know some of the studies we do, it's kind of logistic wise and funding wise, right? Because if we had unlimited money, we would keep like those trials for 10 years and kind of see what happens after 10 years, but we're kind of relying on external funding. So a lot of the times we do those field trials for 2 or 3 years, and then a lot of farmers ask, we can expect this in the first 2 or 3 years, but like what happens if I keep using those practices 5 years or 10 years from now? And there's this idea that, as the system evolved, there's this idea that, the soils are going to equilibrate and then yields are going to be the same. I mean, I think all of that comes theoretically based on what we would expect to see based on the literature. But again, I don't think we have a lot of long-term trials actually comparing those different tillage treatments in the same field in the same conditions. And I think that's what this project would allow us to do, at least mid-term, 5 years from now. And we'll see if we can keep that rotation going for a little longer.
Hopefully. So, Giovani, thank you so much again for joining me today. I had a really great time speaking with you. And as always, thank you for your efforts in extension. Your resources and publications are always super, super useful to me and also to the farmers that we work with as well.
No, yeah, Kathryn, thanks for having me. And it's been a pleasure to participate here and have a nice conversation with you this morning.
Once again, that was Giovani Preza-Fontes, Extension Field Crop Agronomist at University of Illinois. Be sure to join me for the next episode of Talking Crop, for which I'll be speaking with Dr. Patrick Tranel, also with University of Illinois, about metabolic herbicide resistance and his lab's documentation of the first case of glufosinate resistance in water hemp in Illinois. That episode will release on May 27th. Until then, thanks for Talking Crop.